what I want to give you is a framework, a little bit of a summary of the paper and the links of that summary with what Jordi has provided to you and the different questions, and try and organize your thinking, okay? And in that process, I want to highlight some important things. So I want to highlight things like what is important for the exam, okay? So if you think about the paper of daughters, if I go and look at this paper here, the way it's really organized is we have a motivation for this study. Okay, the author gives a motivation for this study. It says, why is this question important? Why might initial hunch be true? And then the author goes on and gives descriptive statistics. So if I go on to the actual paper, it's very common when you see sort of literature like this that people will tell you a little bit about their data set. Right? Will tell you, what are the characteristics of my data set? Okay, how many Democrats do I have? How many Republicans? What's the now score for Republicans? How many children do Republicans have? What's the fraction of white and what's the fraction of black, etc., etc., etc. So if you look at this first table here, note that any variable that we have here, with very few exceptions, so for example, in the data set that Jordi provided, we really don't have dummy variables that tell us whether you're Christian or non-religion or anything of that sort. So we're not going to be able to find these numbers here, okay? We do have democratic vote shares, we do have now scores, we really have everything else, okay? We really have everything else. We don't have the total number of children divided in this way, but that's something that we can figure out, okay? So for example, if you wanted to replicate any of those numbers, okay? If you wanted to replicate any of those numbers, imagine that, can anyone pick any of these numbers here that you'd want to replicate? Like, which numbers here would you want to replicate? Pick one. Do you want to pick one? 127. So if I go at 127, I'm looking at the full sample, and I want to look at number of female children, right? Number of female children in the full sample, okay? So what I would do is I would go on to Stata, and say, I want to get the right. And then what I'm looking for here is I'm looking to summarize the number of girls for the full sample. And what I see here, I see that I have this 1.27. Okay, so the author is really neatly organized in this very nice table all the means of all her variables. Okay, both for Democrats and Republicans. Okay, so that's the first approach here. So the first bit here is that the author has given you descriptive statistics. This descriptive statistic, or your ability to come up with this descriptive statistic, it's given to you in question 1 to 3 of the empirical exercise. So tabulating things, figuring out how the now score is, etc., etc. What does that mean? That simply means that if you have access to data and you have access to the data set, both things that you do, you should, in principle, be able to replicate this table in full. Okay? You should be in the position to say, Table 1 of this AER publication, I can do it myself. Okay. Next is to talk a little bit about the identifying assumptions. Anyone can tell me, what do you mean when we talk about this identifying assumptions? What are identifying assumptions? This is a very common question on exams. So what are the important things for the exam, or just important things to understand? I've put here IA for identifying assumption. Anyone wants to give a stab at what is an identifying assumption? What is an identifying assumption, or assumptions for that matter? Okay, you could have a few of them. You might need a few identifying assumptions. Here's what identifying assumptions are. Identifying assumptions is whatever assumptions you need to make in order to be fairly convinced that what you're establishing now is causality and not simple correlations. Okay? You want to be able to say, I'm fairly confident that this data that I have is showing causality of the effect of daughters in this case on voting behavior for fathers. On voting behavior for fathers. What is the main identifying assumption in this particular paper? Well, the author already talks about this because it's going to be an important one. So after she gives you the descriptive statistic, almost immediately the first thing that she goes is identifying assumptions. Okay? Says, under what assumptions will this data set make sense? And the assumptions are that the gender mix is random. In other words, that the representative in Congress do not have a bias, okay, a gender mix between the two. And in order to really convince yourself about this assumption, you need to test it. Okay, so question five concerns itself with testing this assumption. How can you test this assumption? Okay, you can test this assumption by asking questions like, is the mix between male and female 50-50? Given that I have two children, right? Given that I have two children, is it true that the proportion of male and female will be 50-50, as it should be? Okay. So those are the type of questions that you need to ask, okay? Then those are the type of hypothesis testing that we need to do, and that's exactly what question 5 is aiming at doing, okay? So these t-tests on question 5, which we'll get to in a second, are actually quite important, okay, to understand. So these are the identifying assumptions. We need to test these identifying assumptions if we can, okay, if we can, and note that tests are always limited, okay? Imagine, for example, that you saw a 50-50, perfect 50-50 ratio on male and female. Does that mean that all representatives have no preferences? Does that mean that all representatives have no preferences? Not at all. Let me give you an example. Imagine that half of the representative were doing a fertility stopping rule that she talks in the paper, and they wanted boys. And the other half wanted girls. So they both had preferences on whether to have boys or girls, but the data shows to you, just because it was split in half, as if they had no preferences. Okay? Because it's only concerned about the averages. So statistics really just provides you further evidence. It never proves anything. Okay? It never really proves anything. You have to kind of think about that aspect. Right. So once the identifying assumptions you've isolated the identifying assumption, you've tested for this identifying assumption. Effectively, what you have is you have something as a valid counterfactual, right? You have a valid counterfactual that you can make inference, that you can try and establish causality. So question 10, for example, tests your understanding whether you understood this meaning of counterfactuals and causality here. Now, the next thing that it's on the empirical exercise is pushing you to think on this idea of using bad controls. Okay? What you should realize in the empirical exercise is that if you simply run a regression, right? If you simply run a regression of the now score on the number of daughters, sorry, let's go here. If you simply run a regression on the now score with the number of daughters, what you will see is a negative relationship. So more daughters are actually leading to less liberal outcomes or less liberal voting patterns. Why is that? Because you are missing good controls. You have bad controls there. What is the missing ingredient? Is that you realize that Republicans, who are more conservative, also tend to have bigger families. So if you have bigger families, you will also have more daughters. So when you regress the now score with the number of daughters, effectively what you're picking up by showing a high number of daughters, you're also picking up the higher probability of you being a Republican, right? And that's why that's negative. The moment you control for the number of children, which is the right thing to do, the moment you control for the number of children, that thing disappears, okay? That negative relationship disappears, and all of a sudden it becomes positive. So the author explains the identifying assumption, says that I need to control for the total number of children, right? And before she gives you the results, here's two very nice graphs, okay? Right? These graphs here, this interpretation of the graphs, in the empirical exercises, Jordi is looking at questions like, what is the average now score for legislators with 2 boys, for legislators with 1 boy and 1 girl, for legislators with 2 girls? Is this consistent with our theoretical prediction? This questions here, this question 7, effectively get you to think about the things that you're going to need to build this graph here. So this is question 7. What do you notice when you see this graph? What is the author doing? He's focusing on only representatives with 2 children. If you focus on representative with just 2 children, what you get is you're controlling for the number of children. Okay? You're controlling for that number of children. Now, see if you can do this exercise for like 30 seconds. Focusing just on the full sample, what do you think is the average impact on the now score? What is the average impact on the now score for having a daughter, for having an extra daughter? What is the average impact? 30 seconds. Anyone has a number? Just focusing on this sample, what's the average impact of having an extra daughter for representatives with 2 children? What's the extra effect of having an extra daughter with representative of 2 children? Let me try and run you through this exercise. It shouldn't be, hopefully once I go over it, you can see it. What happened to the average now score for people that had no daughters to people that had 1 daughter? Well, it jumped by approximately 15, a little bit under 15. Okay, sorry, it jumped by about 10, right? From 35 to about 45. What happened to these people that went from a daughter to 2 daughters? Well, it jumped by about 15. If I ignore the differences in the numbers here, let me do a simple average, just because I just want a rough number. This jumped by 10, this jumped by 15. So roughly, right, roughly, the average should be something between 10 and 15. So about 12.5, for example. I want you to understand that a regression is nothing more than that simple calculations that calculation that I did over there. Okay, so if I run a regression on the now total, on number of girls, if total children is equal to 2, I should get a number as a coefficient that is very close to what you can see visually. Lo and behold, this coefficient is just as we expected, something between 10 and 15. Okay, so this regression here if I do this, if total children is equal to 2, what I'm effectively doing is I'm controlling for the total number of children. So what the author is effectively giving you here is like a regression, but in a very simple setting. It's giving you a visual so you can visualize those regressions, okay? So this bit here is what we just did now. We tried to interpret the regressions via the graphs, okay? Now, the author keeps on going. This is also question 7. So question 7 gets you to think about those bits over there. The author goes further and gives you representative with 3 children. Is the data going in the direction that the author wants? Is the data going in the direction that the author wants? It is for the full sample, right? It is for the full sample, but not so much for the Republicans, okay? So the author had to kind of present this and say, well, it doesn't seem like it's holding very well for Republicans, okay? At least that's where the pattern breaks on this particular bit here. But what if the author now wants to do this whole thing, wants to average not just for 2 children and 3 children and 4 children and 5 children, but across the whole board? What does the author have to use? What sort of tools can they use? That's when regressions comes in, right? Regression allows you to do that average, controlling for the number of children, right? So you can do that in one go effectively, okay? So if you look at this bit here, let me ask you a question. Why did the author provide another graph with representatives with 4 children? Why do you think the authors didn't provide a graph that says representative with 4 children? Just to give further evidence. Anyone? Yeah.
Maybe the sample size wouldn't have been big enough.
Perfect. The answer is maybe the sample size wouldn't have been that high. And that's really the right answer. The sample size would have been probably diminishing small, and the author has already made her point here, right? Has already made a point that I see a pattern between these two. And finally, the final thing that I kind of want to discuss is the author then goes on and says, I would like to show you how the regression looks like. I gave you descriptive statistic, I gave you identifying assumption, I tested for those identifying assumptions, I gave you some graphical illustration of the simplest forms of regressions, okay? And now I'm just going to go on and give you a full-blown sort of like the effect of female children on, on congressmen effectively, and she finds, with just one exception, or actually just focus on this now score for a second, she finds that this is statistically significant. And we can run these regressions quite easily, okay? And that's what Jordi does in the empirical exercises when it asks you to do different things. At the end, we do further robustness checks. What are further robustness checks? Is we just look at this other scores here. The AAUW score across gives us further robustness checks, which confirms the author's views that this is indeed the case. So, in conclusion, what are the things that you need for the exam? You need to be able to know what the identifying assumptions are, and you need to be able to interpret the results that get out of your stata. Very likely these are going to be regression coefficients, where units are going to matter, and t-tests like question 5. Okay? That's all I have for today. Thanks for coming. I'll see you next week.